The kitchen was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator. Marcus stood over the small, cluttered table, his gaze fixed on the laptop. It was a relic, held together by strips of silver duct tape that had begun to peel at the corners. He touched the surface. It felt cold and hollow. The machine was his only anchor. He pressed the power button, but nothing happened for several long seconds. Then, the screen groaned to life. It did not shine. It pulsed with a rhythmic, sickly light that cast long shadows across the walls. The flickering light hit the countertop, illuminating a stack of unpaid bills and an empty coffee mug. Marcus gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. The screen stuttered, the glow dimming and brightening in a way that suggested the hardware was holding on by a thread. He stood motionless, watching the cursor blink in the darkness, waiting for the system to catch up to his intent. Everything he had was tied to this single, failing connection to the world. He adjusted his stance, leaned in closer, and waited for the progress bar to move. The progress bar crawled across the screen with agonizing slowness. 1%. 2. It took 40 seconds. Every second felt like a deliberate insult to his patience. Marcus watched the loading icon spin, his eyes stinging from the lack of sleep. He had no office to go to, no savings to fall back on, and no team to share the burden. There was just this kitchen, this table, and the sound of his own shallow breathing. He checked the time on his wrist. The silence of the apartment pressed against his ears, heavy and absolute. He had no safety net. If this machine failed, the path forward simply vanished. He looked around the room. The cupboards were bare. The bills on the counter remained unpaid. He was entirely alone in this endeavor. The screen finally settled on a desktop background that was nothing more than a solid, uninspired gray. The loading cycle ended, leaving him with a blinking cursor and a void of opportunity. He stood up, paced the length of the kitchen floor twice, and returned to the seat. The isolation was not just in the room. It was in the total absence of a plan B. He placed his hands on the table and stared at the blinking prompt, waiting for the first word to materialize. Marcus opened a blank document. The white space was blinding against the dim room. He placed his fingers on the home row, but his index and ring fingers met only hard plastic where the keys should have been. The E and S were gone, leaving behind exposed switches that bit into his skin. He hesitated. He could not type the words service or sales. He could not type best or estimate. He shifted his hands, trying to find a rhythm that avoided the gaps. He had to pivot his wrists at unnatural angles to strike the rubber nubs beneath the missing caps. Every keystroke was a gamble. He typed a letter, deleted it, and typed again. His pulse quickened. He realized he had to rewrite his entire vocabulary to avoid the most common letters in the English language. He leaned into the task, his jaw set hard. He ignored the pain in his fingertips. He ignored the growing cramp in his forearm. He focused entirely on the screen, crafting a proposal that was both functional and desperate. He pressed the final button, finished the sentence, and exhaled. He had created something out of nothing, despite the wreckage beneath his hands. A sharp, shrill chirp cut through the quiet. Marcus looked down. The battery indicator icon had turned a warning red, flashing with a rhythmic intensity that mimicked his own heartbeat. He had 20 minutes of power remaining. He dove under the table, his hands searching for the charger. He found it coiled in a tight, tangled mess near the baseboard. As he pulled, the wire groaned. The protective shielding was stripped away in 3 places, exposing the copper filaments beneath. He plugged the jack into the side of the laptop, but the screen flickered and went black. He held his breath. He shifted the wire an inch to the left, wedging it against the leg of the table to maintain the connection. A spark hissed near the port, a tiny flash of blue light that smelled of ozone. Marcus moved his hand away, then reached back to gently twist the frayed casing. He needed the angle to be perfect. If the wire moved, the laptop died. He sat frozen, his arm extended at an awkward stretch, pinning the wire against the wall. The screen pulsed back to life. He did not exhale. He kept his hand steady, locked in place, knowing that any tremor in his fingers would snap the fragile circuit and erase the progress he had fought so hard to make. Marcus finally eased his hand away from the charger, his fingers stiff from the tension. The screen held steady. He opened a browser tab, the search engine dragging as it loaded local business listings. One by one, he clicked through entries. Most of the links were dead. He closed them, clicked the next, and hit a wall of outdated contact forms that refused to submit. He forced himself to ignore the frustration, shifting his focus to the next directory. He opened a new email window. Subject line, proposal. He pasted the text he had labored over, adjusted the company name, and hit send. He immediately opened the next tab. Copy, paste, send. His movements became mechanical. The cursor blinked in the rhythm of a metronome. He reached the 10th email, then the 20th. His eyes burned from the glare, but he did not look away. He cycled through the directories again, searching for smaller businesses, independent shops, and local startups. He sent another 10, then another. He worked with a cold, singular focus, stripping away the hope for an immediate response and replacing it with the raw, repetitive motion of the grind. 50 emails queued in the sent folder. He leaned back, his ears ringing with the silence of the room, and waited for a notification that did not come. The clock on the wall clicked over to midnight. The room went cold as the heating system shut down for the night. Marcus stared at the inbox. It was empty. The white light of the screen glared against the dark walls, illuminating nothing but a blinking cursor in the search bar. He refreshed the page. The loading icon spun, slowed, and stopped. Still nothing. He pushed his chair back, the metal legs scraping harshly against the floorboards. His spine felt like a rusted hinge. He arched his back, trying to force a pop from his vertebrae, but only a sharp, dull ache responded. He stood up, his knees locking, and leaned his weight against the edge of the desk. The silence in the room was absolute, a heavy weight that pressed against his eardrums. He looked at the laptop, then at his hands, which were still trembling from the hours of typing. He had poured every ounce of his remaining energy into those 50 messages. He had checked the spam folder, he had checked the trash. There was no error message, no bounce back, just the hollow reality of ignored effort. He let his shoulders drop, his head hanging low, as the crushing weight of the day settled into his bones. Marcus turned his back on the desk. Every step felt heavy, as if the floorboards were pulling at his feet. He reached the window and pressed his forehead against the cool, vibrating glass. Outside, the streetlights stretched in a long, unbroken line, casting yellow pools of light onto the wet pavement below. Cars moved past, distant and silent, their headlights cutting through the dark. He watched a taxi slow down, drop off a passenger, and drive away into the night. It looked so easy from here, just a world of people going somewhere, doing things that mattered. He gripped the window frame until his knuckles turned white. The thought settled in his mind like lead. Stop. Just close the laptop, leave it on the table, and walk out the door. The apartment was cramped, the air was stale, and the future he had imagined felt like a ghost. He looked at his own reflection in the glass, a faint, blurry shape against the backdrop of the city. He didn't recognize the exhaustion in his own eyes. The silence of the room behind him seemed to grow, waiting for him to make the choice. He stood there for a long time, watching the lights, his hand hovering near the lock on the window, ready to turn it and step into the cool air for good. The streetlights flickered, matching the rhythmic pulse of the laptop screen he had left behind. His fingers were still curled around the window frame, the metal biting into his palms. Then, the silence of the room shifted. A voice, sharp and familiar, cut through the exhaustion in his mind. Successful people start with imperfect conditions. The words arrived with the clarity of a bell. He did not move for a long moment, letting the statement take root. The weight of the city outside seemed to shrink. He loosened his grip on the window frame, his knuckles returning to their natural color. He took a slow, steadying breath, feeling the air fill his lungs rather than just the fatigue. He turned back to the room. The laptop remained on the table, a hunk of taped-up plastic and failing hardware, but it no longer looked like a barrier. It looked like a tool. He walked to the desk, pulled the chair out, and sat down. He did not look at the inbox. He did not look at the clock. He pulled the keyboard toward him, his fingers finding their place on the worn keys. He was done waiting for the world to change. He began to clear the screen, clearing the space for a different approach. Marcus deleted the previous proposal entirely. The document went white. He did not look for more money or faster growth. He looked for the one hook that would make a stranger stop and read. He typed slowly, his fingers dancing around the missing keys, carefully navigating the gaps in the board. One sentence. Delete. Try again. He focused on the specific pain points of small businesses, stripping away the corporate jargon that had defined his first 50 failed attempts. He drafted, refined, and polished until the tone felt like a conversation rather than a demand. He checked the time, 2:15 a.m. The room was cold, but he did not feel it. He began the process of sending. One email, then another. Each click of the mouse was a deliberate strike against the silence of the night. He hit send on the 10th message, leaned back, and watched the cursor blink against the dark background. The laptop fan whirred, a thin, metallic sound that filled the empty apartment. He did not move. He kept his eyes fixed on the screen, waiting for the flicker to resolve into something other than his own reflection. The clock on the wall crept toward 3, each second feeling like a physical weight pressing down on his shoulders. The clock hit 3. The silence in the room was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that seemed to press against his eardrums. Marcus remained motionless, his shoulders slumped and his gaze fixed on the center of the flickering screen. He was already preparing to close the lid, to accept the quiet as a final answer. Then, it happened. A sharp, high-pitched ping cut through the air, piercing the stillness with the force of a physical strike. Marcus jolted. His back straightened instantly, his breath hitching in his throat. He stared at the screen, unable to process the sudden flicker of a new notification icon. He leaned forward, his fingers trembling slightly as he hovered over the trackpad. He clicked. A small, local bakery had sent a response. The text was brief, asking about menu design possibilities, but it was there, a real, tangible human connection in the middle of the dark. The adrenaline flooded his system, banishing the exhaustion that had been dragging at his eyes for hours. He did not look away. He did not blink. He read the words again, confirming they were not a glitch or a trick of the light. The silence remained, but it was no longer empty. It was charged with the sudden, frantic potential of an open door. Marcus did not waste a second. He opened a browser tab, searched for design tools, and clicked the download button for a free trial. The progress bar crawled across the screen with agonizing slowness. He tapped his fingers against the table, the metallic sound echoing in the kitchen. When the installation finished, he opened the software. The interface was a maze of unfamiliar icons and toolbars. He ignored the tutorials and dove straight into the canvas, dragging shapes and testing fonts. His eyes burned, but he did not look away from the monitor. He adjusted the layout, deleted a line, and started over. He worked with a frantic intensity, his hands moving across the keyboard to compensate for the missing keys. Every click was deliberate. Every placement was a calculation. He felt the weight of the night pass as he refined the bakery menu, layer by layer, pixel by pixel. He forgot the cold. He forgot his hunger. He only saw the document. As the blackness outside the window began to thin into a pale gray morning, he hit the final save command. He slumped back, his muscles stiff, and watched the cursor blink. The file was ready. The sun began to climb over the neighborhood rooftops, casting a long, steady light across the kitchen table. Marcus sent the file at dawn and then waited. He sat at the kitchen table, his hands folded, watching the inbox. Minutes stretched into an hour. Every time the screen flickered, his heart hammered against his ribs, but the inbox remained empty. He walked to the sink, splashed cold water on his face, and returned to the chair. He checked the connection. He refreshed the page. He stared at the cursor, wondering if the effort had been for nothing. Then, the screen refreshed with a new notification. It was a transfer confirmation, $50. He stared at the number, then at the bank account balance. It was not a fortune, but it was proof. He traced the numbers on the screen with his index finger, feeling the texture of the glass. The weight of the last few months seemed to shift. He had traded his time for a tangible result, and the system had held up its end of the bargain. He stood up, paced the small kitchen, and looked at the laptop. It was no longer just a broken machine held together by tape. It was a tool that had successfully generated value. He exhaled, a long, slow breath, and turned his gaze back to the screen to search for the next opportunity. Marcus looked at the $50 again. It was not enough to fix the laptop, but it was enough to fix the friction. His old mouse dragged against the table's surface, the scroll wheel sticking every few rotations. forcing him to waste precious seconds on simple navigation. He left the apartment, walking to a nearby office supply store. He navigated the aisles, ignoring the expensive electronics and heading straight for the peripherals. He held a new, ergonomic mouse in his hand, feeling the weight and the smooth texture of the rubberized grip. He returned home, plugged the new device into the only working port, and moved the cursor. It glided across the screen with a fluid, silent precision that felt like a revelation. He opened his design software. The difference was immediate. He could select, drag, and drop with half the effort. He spent the next hour testing the sensitivity, clicking through menus, and organizing his workspace. The desk felt different. The room felt different. This small, plastic object was his first real investment in his own potential. It was a bridge from the erratic, desperate scramble of the past weeks to a more controlled, professional standard. He laid his palm over the device, set his fingers, and began to draft a new template for his next outreach project. Marcus sat back, the new mouse responding to every micro-movement of his wrist. He opened his spreadsheet and began the next wave of 50 emails. He focused on the subject lines, refining the language, removing the desperation that had marked his early attempts. He typed with a steady, calculated pace. Click, send. Move to the next. Click, send. The process had a rhythm now, a mechanical efficiency he had lacked before. He sent the final email and waited. He did not pace this time. He organized his files, cleaned his desk, and cleared the clutter from his workspace. He kept his eyes on the inbox. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The silence was heavy, a familiar echo of his early failures. He leaned forward, ready to rewrite the pitch again, when the chime cut through the air. One notification. He clicked it. A landscaping company needed a logo. Before he could even type a reply, the screen blinked again. A local gym requested a digital flyer. A third ping followed, this one from a boutique firm asking for a quote. 3 responses in under a minute. The static barrier of the market had finally cracked. He opened the first message, his fingers already moving, and began the work of scaling his ambition. Success became a matter of volume and correction. Marcus kept a log of every rejection, noting the specific phrasing that failed to convert. He treated each no as a diagnostic tool, trimming the fat from his pitches and sharpening the value proposition. The kitchen table transformed into a workstation of constant iteration. He took on projects that pushed his technical limits, forcing him to learn software and design principles on the fly, often working through the night until the sun hit the far wall. The cycle was grueling, but the friction of the early days had smoothed into a steady, grinding pace. He stopped viewing the lack of resources as a permanent obstacle and started seeing it as a constraint that forced creativity. He mapped his progress in completed files and satisfied clients. Every payment, no matter how small, was reinvested into better tools or more efficient systems. His hands grew faster, his instincts sharper. He internalized the rhythm of the market, learning when to push and when to listen. The doubt that once paralyzed him at midnight was replaced by a clinical focus on the next objective. He was no longer just chasing work. He was building an engine, one small, hard-earned block at a time. The clock on the wall shifted, and the shadows of the kitchen table dissolved into the sharp, clean lines of a high-rise office. 2 years had stripped away the clutter of the old life. Sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling glass, illuminating a space where silence was not an indicator of failure, but a sign of focus. Marcus sat at a desk of polished mahogany, his posture unburdened by the ache that once defined his nights. The air here was climate-controlled, devoid of the scent of dust and stale coffee. Outside the glass, the city he once begged for work now stretched out in a sprawling grid beneath his feet. He was no longer hunched over a flickering screen held together by tape. He sat upright, surrounded by the quiet hum of professional-grade hardware. The transition was absolute. Every surface was pristine, reflecting the light of a career built on the foundation of those long, grinding nights. He placed his hands on the desk, feeling the weight of the mahogany, and looked out at the horizon. He had arrived at the place he once only imagined from a cramped chair in the dark. The view was clear, the path behind him was paved, and the work was no longer a struggle for survival, but a pursuit of scale. Marcus stood and walked toward the glass partition that looked over the main floor. Below him, rows of high-end computers glowed in unison. a grid of light that mirrored the city streets outside. A dozen people sat at their stations, their fingers moving in a steady, rhythmic clatter that filled the room. He watched a senior developer pivot, share a screen, and resolve a technical hurdle in seconds. There were no frayed wires here, no flickering monitors, and no waiting for a boot sequence. The team operated with a shared language of efficiency, passing data and designs across the network with fluid precision. Marcus observed the way they moved between desks, the collaborative friction that sparked new ideas, and the sheer volume of output they generated in a single hour. This was the engine he had been building, now fueled by more than just his own exhaustion. He saw the pride in their focus, the way they owned their tasks, and the calm authority with which they managed their deadlines. He was no longer the sole operator of a flickering machine. He was the architect of a system that functioned even when he stepped back. He looked down at the organized chaos, satisfied that the foundation he laid had held the weight of this expansion. A soft knock sounded at the glass door. A young man entered, moving with a hesitant, dragging gait. He stopped in the center of the office, clutching a weathered notebook against his chest as if it were a shield. His eyes darted across the room, taking in the high-end hardware and the quiet, productive air before finally settling on Marcus. He began to speak, his voice thin and rapid. He listed the reasons his project remained dormant: the lack of venture capital, the unavailability of high-tier software, and the absence of a dedicated office space. He gestured toward the door, suggesting that success was reserved for those who started with these advantages already in place. Every sentence was a pivot away from action, a carefully constructed barrier to protect himself from the possibility of failure. He set his notebook on the edge of the mahogany desk, his fingers trembling slightly as he turned the pages to show empty plans. He sighed, looked down at his shoes, and waited for Marcus to agree that the obstacles were insurmountable. The air between them grew heavy with the weight of his doubt. Marcus remained still, watching the young man, seeing the same shadow of hesitation that had once defined his own kitchen table nights. Marcus did not offer a rebuttal. Instead, he stood and walked toward the mahogany shelving unit behind his desk. He reached past a row of leather-bound industry reports and pulled out a rectangular object wrapped in yellowing, peeling adhesive tape. He held it for a moment, feeling the weight of the plastic casing. Before turning back to the visitor, he walked across the polished floor and set the machine down directly on top of the young man's notebook. The laptop hit the wood with a dull, hollow thud. The young man stopped speaking mid-sentence. He stared at the device. The missing E and S keys left gaping, jagged holes in the keyboard, revealing the exposed metal circuitry beneath. The casing was cracked near the hinge, a permanent scar from a fall 2 years prior. In the sterile, light-filled office, the machine looked like an artifact from a different world. It sat there, a physical testament to a time when every keystroke was a gamble and every hour was a battle against total failure. Marcus kept his hand on the lid, pressing down slightly to keep it from wobbling on the desk. The silence in the room shifted. It was no longer filled with the young man's excuses, but with the stark, undeniable evidence of what had actually been required to begin. Marcus leaned forward, his elbows resting on the edge of the desk. He tapped the space where the E key used to be. "I did not build this company with this machine," he said. His voice was level, stripped of any pretense. "I built it with the decision to use it." He pushed the laptop across the surface until it rested firmly in the young man's hands. The visitor looked down, his thumb tracing the jagged edge of the missing key. He looked up at Marcus, his posture straightening, the earlier tremor in his hand subsiding. He nodded once, a slow, deliberate movement that signaled the end of his excuses. He gathered his notebook and the laptop, turned, and walked toward the door with a steadier stride. Marcus did not watch him leave. He turned back to his own desk, pulled his current keyboard toward him, and began to work. The room was quiet again, but the weight of the past had been replaced by the rhythm of the present. He typed, his fingers moving with precision across the keys. The project was already underway. The cycle of building had begun once more, not for the sake of the machine, but for the work itself.